The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope with gold trim, the kind my mother-in-law, Diane, reserved for occasions she considered significant. I remember holding it in the kitchen, my son Eli doing his homework at the table behind me, and feeling a small flicker of warmth. A family dinner. All the grandchildren together. Diane had rented out the private room at Belisario's, the steakhouse downtown where a ribeye cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Isn't that nice?" I said to my husband Marcus, sliding the card across the counter to him. "She's doing something for all the kids." Marcus barely looked up from his phone. "She's been planning it for a month. It's a milestone thing. My dad turns 70 and I guess she wants the whole clan there." I should have paid more attention to the guest list. I should have asked more questions. But that's the thing about slow-building betrayals. They never announce themselves. They arrive dressed as good news, folded neatly inside gold-trimmed envelopes, and you don't see the blade until it's already found the soft part of you. My name is Renata. I married into the Calloway family 9 years ago, and for 9 years I told myself the coldness I felt from Diane was just her personality. A woman who'd built a real estate empire out of grit and didn't have much warmth left over for anyone, including her own son. Marcus had 2 siblings, his older sister Patrice, who had 3 kids and a husband who golfed with Diane's business partners, and his younger brother Todd, who had 2 kids and a wife, Camille, who called Diane Mom in a voice so sugary it made my teeth hurt. And then there was us. Marcus and me and our son Eli, 11 years old, quiet, brilliant, obsessed with dinosaurs and more recently chess. Eli was the only grandchild who wasn't a Calloway by blood, as Diane had once put it at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. A comment she delivered with a smile so pleasant it took me a full 10 seconds to understand she'd just said something cruel. Eli was my son from my first marriage. Marcus had adopted him legally when Eli was 4. On paper, in every court document, in every school form, Eli was a Calloway. But somewhere in Diane's private ledger of who counted and who didn't, he'd been marked with an asterisk since the day Marcus brought me home to meet her. I told myself it didn't matter. Marcus loved Eli with a ferocity that sometimes made me cry when I watched them together. Teaching him to ride a bike, sitting through hours of dinosaur documentaries, showing up to every single chess tournament even when work was brutal. Marcus was Eli's father in every way that counted. I decided a long time ago that if Diane wanted to hold on to some antiquated idea of bloodline, that was her poison to drink alone. But poison doesn't always stay in one cup. The night of the dinner, I curled Eli's hair down with water so his cowlick would behave, and he wore the blue button-down Marcus had bought him for his last piano recital. He was excited. He liked his cousins. Patrice's kids were older and mostly ignored him, but Todd's 2, Bree and Jonah, were closer to his age, and the 3 of them had a running joke about a Minecraft world they were all building together. Eli talked about it the entire drive to the restaurant. Bree said her dad's letting her get the porterhouse, he told me from the back seat. I don't even know what that is. It's a big steak, I said, smiling at him in the rearview mirror. Very grown up. Do you think I could get one too? If you want, sweetheart. It's a special night. I had no idea how special. Belisario's private room glowed amber under low chandeliers. A long table set with more forks than I'd ever known a human being to need. Diane stood at the head of it in a burgundy dress, her white hair swept up, looking every bit the matriarch presiding over her court. Patrice's family was already seated. Todd and Camille arrived a few minutes after us with Bree and Jonah, who lit up when they saw Eli and dragged him to the kids' end of the table. I remember the moment clearly, the way the waiter came around with a leather folder, not a menu, and set it in front of each child. Diane had pre-ordered filet mignon for the younger cousins, ribeye for the older ones, each one hand-selected, she announced with visible pride. The good cuts, nothing under 8 ounces, because this was a night to celebrate family, to celebrate legacy, to celebrate. And here her eyes swept the table with unmistakable warmth, every one of my grandchildren. The waiter reached Eli's place setting. There was no folder. I'm sorry, the young man said, glancing at his list, clearly uncomfortable. Was there supposed to be an order here? Silence. The kind that has weight, that presses against your ribs. I watched Eli's face. He didn't understand yet. He thought it was some mix-up, a simple oversight, and he looked up at Diane with the open trust that children give grandparents by default, waiting for her to laugh and say, "Oh, silly me, of course there's one for you too." Diane didn't laugh. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said, without quite meeting my son's eyes, "Oh, he can just order off the regular kids' menu, sweetheart. The chicken fingers are lovely here. 11 other cousins had ribeyes and fillets sitting in front of leather folders with their names embossed in gold. My son was offered chicken fingers. I felt something in my chest go very still and very hot at the same time, that particular sensation of humiliation and rage arriving together, indistinguishable from each other. Marcus's jaw tightened. Bree, sweet Bree, only 9, said loudly, "Wait, why doesn't Eli get one?" And I have never in my life loved a child more than I loved her in that moment for asking the question every adult at the table was too cowardly to ask. Diane's smile didn't waver. "Because Eli isn't technically one of the grandchildren, honey. Not by blood. This dinner is for the bloodline." She said the word like it tasted good in her mouth. "We can still order him something, of course. No one's trying to be unkind." I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor loud enough that the whole room turned. Eli's eyes had filled with tears he was fighting not to let fall, his small hands gripping the edge of the table, and I have never in my life wanted to overturn furniture the way I wanted to overturn that table in that moment. "We're leaving," I said. Marcus was already standing, already had his hand on Eli's shoulder, already was saying, in a voice I'd never heard him use with his mother before, low and shaking, "You've humiliated my son in front of the entire family, and you think ordering him chicken fingers fixes that?" "Marcus, don't be dramatic," Diane said, though her eyes had gone glassy and defensive now, sensing she'd miscalculated. "It's just steak. He's not being punished, I just think it's important that the bloodline—" "He is my bloodline," Marcus said. "I signed papers. I stood in a courtroom. I chose him, and unlike some people in this family, I don't need DNA to know what love looks like." We left. All 3 of us, walking out of that gilded private room past 11 pairs of eyes and 2 Instagram-ready ribeyes now growing cold beside my sobbing son's empty seat. In the car, Eli didn't say anything for a long time. Then, in a small voice staring out the window, "Was it because Dad's not my real dad?" I turned around in my seat and Marcus pulled the car over into a gas station parking lot, and he got out and opened Eli's door and knelt down on the pavement in his good slacks and said, "I am your real dad." There is no version of that sentence where the word real doesn't include me. Grandma is wrong. Grandma has always been wrong about this, and tonight she finally said the quiet part loud, "And I am so sorry it happened in front of everyone, but I need you to hear me. You are the realest thing in my whole life." Eli cried into his father's shoulder in a gas station parking lot while I sat in the car gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. And somewhere inside me a decision was forming, cold and clear as glass. For 2 weeks nothing happened. Diane texted Marcus a few half-apologies that weren't really apologies. "I'm sorry you felt that way. I hope we can move past this small misunderstanding. Family is family and I love all my grandchildren." Sentences engineered to sound like accountability while accepting none. Marcus didn't respond. I didn't either. Eli went quiet in the way kids go quiet when something has cracked open inside them that they don't have words for yet. He stopped talking about the Minecraft world with his cousins, stopped asking when we'd see Grandma next. I spent those 2 weeks doing something Diane would never have imagined I was capable of. I am a paralegal. I have spent the last 12 years working in family law and estate law, first as an assistant, then after night classes and 2 brutal years of exams, in a role that lets me read wills, trusts, and inheritance documents the way other people read novels. And I remembered something Marcus had mentioned once years ago, almost in passing, that Diane's late husband, Marcus's father Walter, had set up a family trust before he died, one that named all his grandchildren as beneficiaries. All his grandchildren. I pulled the paperwork. Legally, as Marcus's wife and Eli's mother, and because Marcus had power of attorney over some of his late father's remaining estate matters that hadn't been fully settled, I had access to documents most people in this family had never bothered to actually read. I found the trust. I found the language. Walter Calloway, may he rest in peace, a gentler, quieter man than his wife, who had always slipped Eli $20 bills at Christmas and called him the smart one, had set up an education trust years before his death. The language was simple, deliberately broad, drafted by a lawyer who clearly understood families better than Diane ever had, for the benefit of all grandchildren of Walter and Diane Calloway, defined as any child legally recognized as the offspring of Walter and Diane's children, through birth or adoption. Through birth or adoption. Walter had made sure, in ink in a document filed with the county, that no one could ever do to his grandchildren what his wife had just done to Eli at a steakhouse. He'd protected Eli's place in this family with more care and foresight than his own wife had shown in 9 years of Christmases. But that wasn't the twist. That wasn't the 2 weeks later. The twist was this. Diane didn't know I knew. Diane didn't know the trust even still existed in an active, unspent form. She'd assumed, based on comments Marcus later admitted she'd made to him privately, that the education fund had been fully distributed years ago, back when Patrice's oldest went to college. She had been quietly, slowly moving money for years. Money that legally belonged in that trust, meant for education, meant for all the grandchildren, into a separate account she controlled, one she'd been using to fund Patrice's kids' private school tuition and Todd's kids' summer camps and horseback riding lessons. Diane had been systematically siphoning trust funds meant for Eli, among others, for years, funneling them exclusively toward the blood grandchildren, and doing it so quietly that even Marcus, who managed some of the estate paperwork, hadn't fully understood what he was looking at. I understood what I was looking at within 4 days of pulling every document I could legally access. Here is where I want to be honest about who I am, because this story could go in a direction where I become someone unrecognizable to myself, drunk on vindication, burning the family down out of spite. That is not what happened, and I think the truth is more interesting than that anyway. I didn't go to Diane first. I went to Marcus. I laid the documents out on our kitchen table, the same table where Eli did his homework, and I walked my husband through 9 years of quiet financial betrayal committed by his mother against his own son. Against, as it turned out, against Walter's explicit written wishes. Marcus read in silence for almost an hour. I watched something in him shift and harden, the particular grief of realizing a parent is not who you thought they were, a grief that has no name because it isn't quite mourning and isn't quite rage, but sits somewhere cold and heavy between the two. She's been stealing from him, he finally said. For years. While calling him not really family. I think, I said carefully. She convinced herself it wasn't stealing. I think people like your mother build stories where they're always the reasonable one. But legally, this is a trust violation. As trustee, she has fiduciary duties she's broken. This isn't a moral argument anymore, Marcus. This is something a judge would recognize immediately. We didn't want a lawsuit. That's important to say. We didn't want to drag Eli, who was already hurting, into a courtroom, into depositions, into being the center of a family scandal that would follow him into adulthood. What we wanted, what I wanted if I'm being fully honest, was for Diane to understand undeniably and without escape, that the family she thought she was protecting by drawing bloodline distinctions had been built, quite literally, on paper that never recognized her cruelty as legitimate in the first place. Walter had already overruled her. She just didn't know it yet. So 2 weeks after the steakhouse dinner, almost to the day, we requested a family meeting. Not at Belisario's. At our house, at our kitchen table, on our terms. Diane arrived expecting, I think, a reconciliation. She'd brought a bottle of wine and a gift bag for Eli, an overture so transparent it made my stomach turn. A peace offering that still, notably, didn't include an actual apology. Marcus let her sit down. He let her start talking, some rehearsed speech about how family disagreements happen and how she hoped we could all move forward for the children's sake, how Eli was welcome anytime, how she loved him just the same. Then Marcus set the folder of documents on the table between them. I want to talk about Dad's education trust, he said. I watched the color drain from Diane's face in real time, watched the practiced pleasantness she'd built her whole personality around crack for the first time in the 9 years I'd known her. That's old business, she said too quickly. That was settled years ago. It wasn't settled, Marcus said. It's still active. I checked with the estate attorney this week. The same one Dad used. There's over $200,000 that should have been distributed equally among 6 grandchildren for education expenses. Instead, it's been distributed to 4. Bree and Jonah's summer camp, riding lessons, 3 years of Patrice's kids' private school tuition. All pulled from an account you weren't supposed to touch except for education, and never for Eli, because somewhere along the way you decided he didn't count as a grandchild for that purpose either. I raised those children too. In a manner of speaking, I helped. Eli is named in Dad's trust. By his own hand. Dad wrote through birth or adoption into that document years before you sat across from my son and told him in front of the entire family that he wasn't really one of us. My father already settled this argument, Mom. He settled it before he died. You've just been ignoring his wishes for years and hoping no one would notice. Diane didn't cry, not at first. She got angry, the particular anger of someone caught who wants desperately to make the exposure someone else's fault. She said we were twisting Walter's intentions, that Walter surely hadn't meant legally adopted children when he wrote that we were using lawyer language to attack a grieving widow, that this was Marcus's wife, meaning me, poisoning the family with her paralegal nonsense. I let her finish. Then I slid across the table a printed copy of the trust's legal definitions section, the specific clause, drafted and notarized in Walter's own handwriting on an accompanying letter he'd apparently left with his attorney, expressing in plain, unlawyerly English exactly why he'd written the clause that way. I want it understood that Eli is my grandson in every sense that matters, and I won't have anyone in this family ever suggest otherwise on paper or off it. Diane read her dead husband's handwriting, the man she'd been married to for 41 years, explicitly correcting the exact cruelty she would go on to commit 8 years after his death. And something in her finally broke. He cried then. Not performatively, genuinely, the way people cry when they realize they've spent years building a version of themselves that a person who loved them had already quietly disagreed with. She kept saying, "He never told me he wrote that," and Marcus said with a weariness that broke my heart a little, "Maybe he knew if he told you outright you'd find a way around it. Maybe he just wanted it in writing waiting in case you ever needed to be stopped." Here's the part that surprised even me. I expected the fallout, the accusations, the tears, the wounded pride. What I didn't expect was what happened over the following weeks. The slow, humiliating unraveling of Diane's carefully maintained image within the wider family once Patrice and Todd found out, because of course they found out. Marcus, to his enormous credit, didn't hide any of it. He told his siblings the full truth, that money meant for their children's education had, in fact, been drawn disproportionately from a shared trust at the expense of their nephew, that their mother's generosity toward Bree and Jonah's camps and Patrice's kids' tuition had come in part at Eli's expense, funded by money legally owed to him. Patrice was furious, not at us but at Diane, and in a way that surprised me because I'd always assumed Patrice was cut from similar cloth, someone who'd benefited from and therefore excused the family's quiet hierarchy. But it turned out Patrice had her own history with Diane's favoritism, old wounds from childhood I'd never known about, moments where Diane had made it clear that approval in that family was conditional, transactional, contingent on bloodline and usefulness and good behavior. Patrice, it turned out, had been the golden child for most of her life and had never realized how exhausting and precarious that position was until she watched her mother do to an 11-year-old what had quietly been done to her for decades in smaller, harder-to-name ways. "I should have said something at dinner," Patrice told me on the phone, her voice thick. "I saw his face. I saw Eli's face, and I said nothing because I've spent my whole life not saying anything to her, and I am so sorry." Todd, for his part, mostly went quiet, caught between loyalty to his mother and a creeping, uncomfortable understanding that his own children's advantages had come at least partly at the cost of a boy who'd done nothing but exist in a family that decided, arbitrarily, he didn't fully belong. Diane spent the following month attempting damage control, offering to redistribute the trust funds retroactively, offering Eli a savings bond, offering increasingly desperate gestures that all missed the actual point, which was never really about money. It had never been about stake either, not really. It was about a woman who had decided quietly and consistently over 9 years that love in her family was a limited resource to be rationed according to bloodline, and who had finally been forced to confront, in her dead husband's own handwriting, that even the man who'd built that fortune with her had disagreed. I wish I could tell you Diane transformed. Real life rarely offers stories that clean. What actually happened was slower and more complicated than a redemption arc. She apologized to Eli. A real apology this time, stammering and imperfect, delivered at our kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon 3 months later, with Marcus and me sitting close enough to Eli that he could feel us there but far enough that this could be, if he wanted it to be, between the two of them. She told him she'd been wrong. She told him Grandpa Walter had loved him fiercely and had made sure, even after death, that no one could take that away from him. She told him she was sorry it took so long, and sorrier still that it took getting caught to say it. Eli, 11 years old and wiser about people than I think I'd been at 30, listened to the whole thing and then asked her one question: "Are you going to do it again? To someone else?" Diane didn't have an easy answer. To her credit, she didn't pretend to. "I don't know," she said. "I've been the way I am for a long time. But I'm going to try." It wasn't the ending I would have written if I were inventing this story from nothing. I would have wanted a cleaner villain, a more satisfying collapse. A woman who either transformed completely or was cast out entirely, banished from our lives with dramatic finality. What I got instead was messier and, I think now, truer. A grandmother who slowly, awkwardly over the following year started showing up differently. She came to Eli's chess tournaments, sitting stiffly in folding chairs among parents half her age, learning enough about the rules to ask him halfway intelligent questions afterward. She sent him a birthday card that didn't feel performative for the first time in his life. She never fully became warm. Some people don't have that particular capacity, or have spent so many decades armoring against it that it atrophies past recovery, but she stopped making him feel like an asterisk. That, it turned out, was most of what he'd ever wanted. The trust was redistributed properly with an actual attorney overseeing it this time, not left to Diane's discretion. Eli's education fund sat there, growing, a quiet correction to 9 years of quiet exclusion, evidence in black and white that somewhere, a man who loved him had made sure the world couldn't erase him from the family ledger, even after he was gone. Me. I think about that night at Belisario's sometimes. The leather folder that never came, the chicken fingers offered like a consolation prize for existing in the wrong configuration of DNA, my son's face crumpling in real time as he understood for the first time that his own grandmother had drawn a line and placed him outside it. I think about how close I came to simply swallowing it the way I'd swallowed 9 years of smaller cruelties before it, because that's what you do sometimes. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight, you tell yourself family is complicated, you tell yourself boys are resilient and this too shall pass. But some things shouldn't pass unchallenged. Some humiliations deserve consequences, not because vengeance feels good. Though I won't pretend it didn't a little watching Diane read her husband's handwriting and understand she'd been overruled from beyond the grave. But because children learn what they're worth by watching how the adults around them respond when someone treats them as less than. I wanted Eli to learn watching his father stand up in that private dining room and his mother spend 2 quiet weeks turning humiliation into hard evidence, that the people who loved him would not simply absorb an injustice and call it manners. I wanted him to learn that love shows up, and that sometimes it shows up wearing a paralegal's reading glasses at a kitchen table at midnight, cross-referencing trust documents with a fury too precise to be called anything but devotion. 2 weeks after the steak dinner, Diane Calloway thought the matter was closed, filed away under family disagreements best forgotten. She had no idea her late husband had already settled the argument years before she ever opened her mouth at that restaurant. That somewhere in a filing cabinet in his own hand was proof that the family she thought she alone governed had already quietly chosen my son. All it took was 2 weeks and a folder she never expected me to read, for her to finally understand that some bloodlines are written in ink, and some are written in love, and only one of them had ever truly been hers to define.